Hello, Homo sapiens. I'm Repa Kustipia. Today we are talking about definitions of local food for some ethnicity in Indonesia. So in the discussion, it was stated that the definitions of local versions of food according to the law is food consumed by local people in accordance with local potentials and wisdom. But how to define local food in Indonesia, where there are many ethnicities and even multicultural? So first, you have to look at how the definitions of Indonesia as a whole is. But I will tell you briefly before giving information about what is local and what is a local food. So Indonesia is located on the equator as a tropical country, has both small and large islands, and then for the system of government in Indonesia, there are several. The 1945 constitutions as the basic law, whereafter the Indonesian state was proclaimed and became an independent, united, sovereign state based on the constitutions. So Indonesia is indeed a constitutional state. That's why it would be very strange if a legal state didn't have clear food laws. So if you wanted to discuss basic law based on the 1945 constitutions. So it is clear that is Indonesia's goal as an independent country is to build a unified Indonesian Republic, sovereign and able to protect all nations and bloodshed. So in the paragraph, is it clear, yeah? And promote public welfare and educate the nation's life and participate in creating lasting world peace based on justice and humanity. So Indonesia's form of government is a republican unitary state known as a presidential characteristic by its leaderships as a president and the president as the head of state and head of government. The president of Indonesia is also the highest executive leader who is assisted by ministers in Indonesia. So the rest of the regions in Indonesia are the provincial, city and district levels. Then, Indonesia is also a state of law, not a state of power. There are legal and statutory boundaries. Indonesia is a welfare state for the people. If it is properly practiced by all residents or by the Indonesian nation itself. So it means that here explaining the interest of law to realize the ideals of the state. We call it merdeka. Merdeka it means freedom. So namely social welfare for all Indonesian people, not just for your family and not just for your colleagues. The system of government should be clear. It is the climate in Indonesia that affects agricultural productions broadly. So in terms of food commodities, be it overall food or local food, the climate in Indonesia is monsoons, hot and sea, and the monsoons climate is the influence of the winds from the southwest and northeast monsoons. So this hot climate is also called the tropical climate because Indonesia is indeed on the equator. So as a result, the weather conditions in Indonesia are on average hot, and after that it rains too. Now it's raining here. So the last is the marine climate. As Indonesians who lives in areas in the archipelago are indeed surrounded by seas and even oceans. So the nature of this climate is humid and often rains, and this affects what local food will grow and be produced from areas like this. Defining local food in Indonesia must look at patterns of the regions, such as its locations is an archipelago. There are also many rivers inside the islands, and then Indonesia has rivers, mountains, seas, straits, bays, capes. Do you know what a cape is? A cape is a tip. In a basic geography lessons, it was stated that what is meant by a cape is land that just into the sea, or land that is surrounded by sea on three sides. Then Indonesia also has lakes and highlands. This will greatly affect the type of agriculture and producing commodities from locations like this and are cultivated well ground naturally or utilized, exploit to taste by the people who occupy it. Local food in Indonesia can be sourced from a variety of flora. There are many varieties of flora in Indonesia. There are protected flora, such as the hangkang tree. You know hangkang tree? Hangkang tree, we call it a pohon hangkang or Palaculum lelocarpum. So in Kalimantan, talk about call it pohon jelutung or a jelutung tree, usually used for household appliance. Yeah, but the sap is used for gambas or permen karet. So then the flora of fruits producing trees in Indonesia, for example, palm tree. Palm tree or Arenga pinnata is a type of a palm plant that produces fruit, sap, and starch or flour in the stem. And palm sap is used for sugar and palm wine. And yeah, there are also Indonesians local foods that are categorized as a medicinal plants. So in Indonesia itself, there is a course in the field of herbal medicines called Anafarma. Yeah, different from pharmacy, but still related. And several medicinal plants, commodities that are food commodities, for example, god leaves. God leaves, you mean, do you know daun dewa? Daun dewa is a Ginura sagetum, okay? In Chinese people or in Indonesia, yeah, Chinese people in Indonesia or the Peranakan, they say samsit. Yeah, the Sundanese say it is life-sustaining. Ethnobotanically, the Sundanese people have a cultural story of healing leaves from Sanghyang Widi. Sanghyang Widi, it means that's God. Yes, that was a symbol in ancient times. Indeed, functionally, the leaves of the gods are lalap or salad or raw food for the Sundanese people themselves with anti-inflammatory properties. Then from a glance at the definitions of local food resources, and you can start with a brief search for information from the province, and then more specifically through the divisions of regions from district or cities. There are lots of them. Yes, from the islands of Sumatra, Java, Kalimantan, Bali, Nusa Tenggara, Sulawesi, Maluku, and Papua has a lot of diversity. After that, start with regional potentials such as agricultural or agro potentials. So in Indonesia itself, food commodities in general such as rice, cloves, nutmeg, coffee, copra, tea, peanuts, sugarcane, and corn. Even Indonesia has superior food commodities which are local food from an area. And local food in Indonesia cannot be generalized. That local food according to Sundanese people is also local food according to Papuans. It's really different. So West Java's local food commodity is rice. It cannot be mentioned local food in Papua. Sagu is not a local food in West Java because it has to wait for the distributions of trade in food commodities from Eastern Indonesia. So it can be concluded that the definitions of local food actually approaches the definitions according to the previous food laws, namely food with regional potentials that is consumed by the community. So that is a local food in Indonesia. And when discussing Indonesians' local food, ethnic involvement, regional potentials, the languages in which food commodities are mentioned, the influence of religions in Indonesia must also be explained because there are several local food commodities and which are indeed special food rituals in cultural celebrations, and this cannot be eliminated even if it is only symbolic. And then but yeah, I just remember, but this tradition still exists to this day. You cannot blame the influence of globalizations on how sophisticated technology is. When a habit and traditions has been formed, what needs to be studied more deeply is in essence and functions for the future generations like me or the young generations, if it has a visible impact on the environment and leaves only waste and garbage that accumulates and cannot be recycled. Talking about local food for various ethnicities in Indonesia cannot be separated from various agreements. Ancient books left by several kingdoms in Indonesia, because before Indonesia became a unitary republic, as it is today, there are still many relics from the past. And there are generations of descendants who are still alive, no matter how many generations. And that must be a concern in the scope of the definitions of locality in a commodity that involves locations and community, other things such as the way of life for each community. For example, the Sundanese people's life guidelines written on palm leaves named Sanghyang Siksa Kandang Karesian. Do you know it? Sanghyang Siksa Kandang Karesians are Sundanese community guidelines. And indeed, the disseminations of information from the past, like Sundanese elders, we call it Sesepuh Orang Sunda, is always passed down from mouth to mouth using tales or stories, and it is passed down and hereditary and minimally written for a documentations. So the artifacts are minimal. However, it can be traced from ancient manuscript in circulations. In Sanghyang Siksa Kandang Karesian, it doesn't mention food commodities in details, but there are recipes, plants which are part of the living records are defined as lalap. Lalap itself is indeed included in the recipes segment, from the tutuwuhan. Tutuwuhan is a plants. Plant sections which is indeed suggested to be close to Sundanese settlements. Therefore, there are yards of Sundanese people whose contents are food sources. It is not surprising that lalap dish will always be served. And if it is categorized as a type of raw food diet, it has indeed been since the 16th century, since the kingdom of Sunda existed, that various plant sources of food become sources of consumptions other than animal or meat. Likewise, other ethnic groups in Indonesia must have their own definitions of local food. They don't have to display local food that no longer exists, but just according to the momentum, according to the era, and most importantly, local food today is consumed by the people, is in maybe in locations, even though it has been lots of commodity migrations, but if cultivated, it will add to the local food list, local food list in the area. That is an introduction to the definitions of local food for various ethnic groups in Indonesia. I think that's enough. Hatur Nuhun.